Welcome to the No Truth Without Beauty Discovery series. Let's hear what author Lina Al-Ali has for us. What does the Qur'an have to say about clothing?
It's interesting. The Qur'an speaks about clothing in general terms in a cluster of verses in chapter 7. And there it addresses both men and women to say that clothing is bestowed upon humankind by God to cover the intimate parts, which specifically refers to the groin areas, and as a thing of beauty. And then it goes on to say that we should bring our beautiful clothing, our zina, to every act of prayer. God wants to see us dressed nicely for every act of prayer. And then it goes on immediately afterwards to say, and who has forbidden what God has bestowed? Who has forbidden this beautiful attire that God has bestowed upon humankind? So it's really, quite extraordinary. And after asking that question, who dares forbid what God has bestowed, this beautiful attire, God then says, God has only forbidden indecencies, sin, wrongful oppression, and associating things with God that He did not authorize. Those are the four things. These are the only four things that God has forbidden. So, in sum, the purpose of clothing is to cover the private parts. Clothing is supposed to be beautiful, and no one has the right to forbid beautiful clothing, including and perhaps especially when it comes to prayer. But there's something else that is very interesting in that first verse where God talks about why clothing and that it's supposed to also be a thing of beauty. The verse continues by saying that but no clothing can rival the clothing of reverence. The clothing of reverence is best of all. So it's to say that the external things are important, but the internal attitude, the spiritual attitude and moral attitude, of course, is best of all. Nothing can rival that. And this reminds me of when I tried to get into a famous mosque in the Middle East on some of my travels, a beautiful mosque. And I went and I thought I was appropriately dressed. I came ready with my floor-length skirt, my long top, my long loose top, my shawl over my head. But the guard was not comfortable letting me in. And after some discussion, he admitted that there was a bit of ankle showing, apparently. On one side of my skirt, there was a bit of a gap. It was the design of the skirt, there was a bit of a gap, and there were about maybe 2-3 inches of ankle showing. And, I don't know how he even saw that, but he did. And he said, we just don't want to get in trouble with the people inside, but it's all right, I'll resolve it. He sent off someone to get me appropriate clothing. But when the clothing arrived, I started to put it on, it was clear that it was meant for a small girl. And the skirt didn't even reach, the floor. It barely came down to below my knee. And then there was a certain kind of shawl, where there's a cutout and the head shows. And I said to him, but this barely fits. He said, just put it on top of your clothes and you'll be fine. I said, but it doesn't make sense. If the ankle is the offending thing, this doesn't even cover it. And he said to me, but this is better because God will be pleased with you. He will be, this is for your own good. So it's very difficult, and I wanted to tell him, do you know that the clothing of reverence is best of all? This is we're kind of trapped in this pedantic way of thinking, whereby everywhere you go, they want you to dress in a specific way. I've been to some parts of the world where trousers are a no-no. Skirts are the way to dress, apparently. And up to the knee or below the knee is good enough, as long as you don't wear trousers. Trousers are a no-no. And then there are other places where you must wear trousers because they don't want to see, unless the skirt is fully floor length and there's no ankle showing. So it's very difficult to get it right, and everybody has a specific way. Every culture seems to have its own take on what appropriate dress is. It's very difficult when what God is interested in is something completely different.
So, is there a dress code for women in the Qur'an, and what does it say?
It's assumed that there is a dress code because of a couple of verses that I'll talk about now. I have said repeatedly, and I say this throughout the book, it's very important to look at all of the verses on a given subject before we, make a pronouncement as to what the Quranic stance is on that subject. So in looking at some of the other verses on clothing, there are a couple of verses, there are two consecutive verses that address men and women with regards to clothing. The first tells men to cover their private parts and be chaste and so on. And then the second one speaks specifically to women to say that women should cover their zina, again the same word, now meaning sort of their natural adornment, to cover their zina except what ordinarily or customarily appears, which is an important phrase because there are customs and there are habits that are considered acceptable in a society. So except what ordinarily appears is the reason why scholars allowed a lot of women, even back then, to wear very little because they were involved in domestic work. They went about doing whatever they did, and there are things that were considered acceptable. So that's one thing to point out, to sort of cover themselves except what customarily appears and is considered acceptable. And then it says, and for them to draw their shawls over specifically their breasts. And this is an important point to make because zina in this context, which is the natural adornment of women, refers to breasts because unfortunately, or surprisingly, back then there was a fashion amongst women in Medina to wear vests that were cut open in the front, which seems outrageous to us today, but that was the custom. So what the Qur'an was saying there, to tell the believing women to draw their shawls, the khimar were head dresses that women wore back then that came down and round the back. So imagine the headdress coming down and around the back, and then this open vest with everything showing. So the verse is saying, tell the believing women to pull their shawls over their breasts, except to, and not show that zina, that natural adornment, except before a surprisingly large number of men who are considered part of the family and part of the households, and it's actually an extraordinary accommodation to the customs of the time. In a verse later on, God makes it clear that He prefers even the breasts to be covered in front of sons and fathers-in-law and domestic workers and slaves, etc. But for the moment, the circle is kept quite large, which is really, really surprising, but it shows the extent to which there was sort of deference to human agency and what society was accustomed to. But what has happened is that over time, the word zina, when it applies to women and women's natural zina, women's natural adornment, has been expanded from meaning specifically the breasts to including every part of the skin, for example, in some cases even the face and the hands, as we know now, the hair, and so on and so forth, the silhouette, the very shape, Some people even consider a woman's voice as a zina that should not be heard. So that's part of the problem. But then, we have to continue looking at the other verses. There is another verse where God says to the Prophet to tell, his wives and daughters and the other believing women to pull their cloaks over themselves. And the verse specifically says, so that they will be known, so that they may be known and not harmed. So this is where the cloaking idea comes from in a lot of countries that have been requiring women to wear a big cloak on top of everything else. But what this was referring to is that back then, when women would go out into the wild to answer a call of nature, unfortunately, sometimes they would get harassed. And sometimes when those harassing men were confronted, they would say, oh, we didn't know that they were women from your tribe. We thought they were whatever. And so this was like a signal to say, these are women from amongst our tribe, and, hands off, and you do not bother them. So it was a public safety measure, a security measure to say, tell the women to pull their cloaks, tell the believing women to pull their cloaks over themselves, or wrap them around themselves. So this is where that idea of a cloak comes from. So is there a dress code as such? Well, you tell me. This is the context of those two verses that speak about clothing with regards to women specifically, or these two sets of verses.
We hear a lot about hijab. What about it? Isn't a woman supposed to cover her hair according to the Qur'an?
The Qur'an itself never ever mentions women's hair, or anyone's hair, for that matter. The word hijab does occur in the Qur'an. It occurs 8 times, I believe. And in each case, it really is referring to something that separates two things from each other. It's either a screen or a curtain or a barrier that separates two things from each other. And the 8 different contexts are varied. The one that has been given the most attention is one whereby God is referring specifically to the Prophet's wives, because they were in a situation whereby they had visitors coming in and out all of the time, because everyone wanted to be with the Prophet. Everyone wanted to hang out with him. Everyone wanted to be in his company. They wanted to ask him questions, and there was no privacy in the home. And very often, people would come and linger a lot to basically ask for the wife's intercession, for a given wife's intercession, because the wives had their different homes, of course, to ask for their intervention, their intercession, to ask them. And so this was going on so much, there was absolutely no privacy, and those were very, very small homes that they lived in. They were barely, we're talking about small rooms. So there is a verse that says that with regards to the Prophet's wives, with all these people coming in and out, basically, to speak to them from behind a hijab, from behind a curtain. The intention there was to afford them privacy, and also because, these are the Prophet's wives. All these people coming in and out, and there's even a verse where God tells them to go home and not to overstay their welcome, because the Prophet is too polite and too hospitable to tell them to go away. So that is the verse that has been zeroed in on with regards to women. It applies specifically to the Prophet's wives. God is very specific in other verses that what applies to the wives of the Prophet does not apply to everybody else. They are special. They have a unique position. For example, they are not to marry after his passing. They are not to remarry because they are not like other women, and other things like that. So hijab, as applied to women's heads, women's hair, or the like, that is not in the Quran.
Thank you for watching. Hope this episode has enticed you to discover the book No Truth Without Beauty, God, the Qur'an, and Women's Rights for yourself. All links are available in the description box below this video.